Today on Creative Set Plays, I'm delighted to say we are joined by football's first substitution coach, Sammy Lander. So, Sammy, welcome to Creative Set Plays.
Thank you for having me on. I'm very excited to to talk my main passion subs, but then also touch on what I'm hoping to delve a little bit more into. So set pieces should be a nice combination.
Brilliant. And just before we do get into that, I don't know if you could just start off by telling our listeners a little bit about the sort of work you've done for different clubs and football organizations.
Yeah. So I mean, the service or role I deliver is quite holistic. Effectively, it's driven from the theory that I think substitutions are an underutilized part in modern football. I think it's a very traditional role, both for players and managers, and that sort of come from their own feedback. So a lot of what I do is I go in and sort of create a methodology for the substitutes or the finishers that allows them to sort of have a process to follow and really challenge that negative connotation that typically comes associated with a role, but also help teams become a little bit more deliberate with how they substitute when they substitute and you know become a weapon. I think being able to now in the modern game bring five fresh players on, potentially half your outfielders, it's a major tool. So being able to to utilize that to its max and modernize the role of a sub is probably the best way I define my role.
Great. And yeah, I guess another great example, right, of how these teams can try and squeeze some more marginal gains to help them win, right? Um,
Really.
okay, yeah. So obviously today we're going to focus on set plays and how substitutions relate to that. So I don't know if you could just start off by telling us um, why coaches should view substitutes as a key tool to improving their output from set plays.
Yeah, I think again it links to probably where this whole role came from and the fact that I think they're quite underutilized. I think it's starting to become a little bit more of a sort of spotlight shone upon it in terms of the benefits that you can have and how you build your bench and the way that you can account for set pieces, through using your bench. But I think there's a lot of value in looking at other sports such as basketball, where they build their bench around moments like this. Now, obviously, it's going to be a little bit variant because of the rolling subs and the amount of dead ball situations they have in their sport compared to ours. But I think there's a real value in being able to align these sort of two. I wouldn't even call them marginal gains in today's game. These sort of two gains to make it sort of as lucrative or as fruitful as possible for teams.
Yeah, nice. And I think it's an interesting point you've made there about taking some ideas maybe from other sports like basketball. I think it's been, well documented that a lot of the routines perhaps, or particularly like the use of blocks and runs that we're seeing in today's game,
Mm.
those ideas have maybe come from other sports. So yeah, really interesting to hear that. Um, I believe you've got some data and some information you're going to share with us now, Sammy.
Yeah. So this is some of the data that we put together. It's usually what I track. It's sort of a mixture of substitution data, and then sort of as the slides progress, we bring in a little bit more of a set piece perspective and a set piece influence on how these sort of two roles or two pieces of data can sort of align. So, on this first slide here is each team's sort of total substitutions, along with sort of what positions those substitutions have been made in. Now, then this in itself drives some really cool insights. Just for example, we look at Newcastle. They've made the least amount of midfield changes this season. That aligns with them. I don't know, if many of your viewers are any Newcastle fans. Obviously, I know yourself is, but with your eye test of looking and going, typically the three that he starts with are the three that finish. So it's about how we can sort of take insight from that and what value and what sort of, I suppose, actionable strategy can we take, whether I work with Newcastle or against Newcastle from that piece of information. But the thing that I sort of wanted to touch on the most really is the increase that we're seeing this season in defenders. So last season at a similar point in sort of the international break, 24% of total substitutions were defenders, whereas this season we're sort of seeing that up to the early 30s. We're at 33.4 now. So almost a 10% increase in Premier League teams choosing to bring more defenders on as opposed to sort of the other units, which I think is a positive for the league. I think we're starting to see teams understand the use and the potential of substitutions. I touched on sort of Man United as a nice example. They change their wing backs quite frequently. Sort of each game, the left and right, they'll bring on sort of fresh players around 65, 70 in order to bring, we would call them energizers, in order to bring sort of a fresh level of sort of intensity to the game and to their game model. Man City and Arsenal have very, very similar patterns in substitutions, and this echoes it. But again, have made the same sort of changes in defence, where when playing out or potentially when sort of looking to go invert or outvert, they'll have the appropriate solutions on their bench. So I suppose the big insight that I've taken is that we're seeing more tactical decisions made through substitutions this season, which I think is only a positive for the league. I think it makes it way more entertaining. But I think as a consequence of this, sometimes there could be probably a knock-on effect to things like set pieces.
Yeah, and just on that increase in defenders being substituted this season,
Mm.
um, substituted on, I take it that is, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, there's been a lot made about teams being more direct this season. A load of long throws we're seeing regularly,
Mm.
game to game. A lot more deep free kicks going into the box. Do you feel that maybe teams are bringing on defenders, I guess, twofold? One, to maybe help defend those situations, but two, to help give them more height to actually attack those moments?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, it's a similar process as to how you choose a starter. You probably wouldn't base your whole decision wholly on it, but it would definitely play a part in the sense that you think they're going to add value. I know we touched on earlier the Eddie Howe press conference the other week where he was talking about Dan Burn being on a yellow, but not being able to bring him off because, Lewis Hall, the alternative coming on, would be, 4, 5, 6 foot. Yeah, inches shorter. So you're talking about what you lose from those dead ball habits or those dead ball situations by making a change like that. So I definitely think it is in certain managers' thoughts as to whether they need to be more prepared for it, less prepared for it. Obviously, Brentford having a lot of success for it. What would be really interesting is to go into this sort of game by game and seeing if we're seeing more defensive changes against certain teams. So, for example, Brentford probably being one of the more lucrative long throw teams this season, whether we're seeing more defensive changes against Brentford in order to sort of like ease that threat. But yeah, I definitely think it's in their thoughts.
Right.
Awesome. I'll just jump on to the second slide. So this is where we sort of start sort of cast an eye a little bit towards the set piece data and sort of how the two align. So this is now substitution goals. So it counts for goals and assists throughout the Premier League. Obviously, the full bar is the total. The grey is from open play, so a substitute scoring a goal or assisting in a goal from open play, and the light blue is if it has been done from a free kick or a corner, so from a set piece situation. So again, this in itself drives loads of sort of cool insights. You'd look at your Evertons and your Forests, and that would probably be a slight concern, particularly if I just sort of jump back a slide and you look at how many attackers have been made by Everton and Forest themselves. Again, probably the majority in both cases. So you're then questioning what are those attackers doing? Because there's a high percentage of forwards that they're bringing on that aren't bringing potentially the goals that you need them to. Forest even more so because I would say a lot of those have probably been in a losing game state. So again, interesting situation to explore. But the thing that I've sort of wanted to highlight the most, obviously you can see Brighton at the top there, is just how many sort of substitution goal contributions they've had from set pieces. Because I think, I mean, I know Yannick quite well, who's the set piece coach down there, and I think he's been really really kind with me in my sort of learning into set pieces. He's been very open with his methodology and his processes. So it's been good to see how he is working and sort of the way that he, I suppose, delivers this success. Now, they've obviously got 5 set piece goals. One thing that might be worth mentioning is that 3 of those have come from the taker. So it's when they've sort of brought a substitute on and it's been the taker that sort of registers the assist. So part of my role of the substitute role is that we go in and we talk to teams about how they might build their bench using data. So having been able to now look at the success that Brighton have had through having a set piece taker on their bench, that might be something that teams going forward look and go, that's something that we need to account for when building sort of our ideal substitution bench. A couple of the other insights, sort of, I would say Arsenal and Bournemouth are the two biggest teams that I've noticed that they are very good at like for like changes. Bournemouth in particular is that when they bring off a profile of winger, they're very good at bringing on a very similar profile of player that they sort of brought off. So their changes are very similar. Now, this has its strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes if you're playing against a team where your current maybe profile isn't working, you might need a change, in which case we then might see less impact. But in a lot of cases, Bournemouth, because they make like for like, they slot right into a routine and a methodology that works for them. So again, really, really successful last season in substitution goal contributions, and I think this season they'll be up there again.
Yeah, and I guess the introduction of five substitutes is a game changer for clubs now. Have you come across many clubs, really considering set plays when making their substitutions? For example, like having a set play specialist on the bench, maybe someone that can throw the ball well long into the box, or potentially bringing on, two or three big aerial targets to completely change the style of play to go really direct in the last period of the game.
Yeah, I think we see. I think the conversations I have, anyways, are more around open play situations, in the sense of, look, the playbook says that if we're 1-0 down at this period of time, we've got a really nice 6'6" striker who's going to be able to come on and be direct. But I think what sometimes teams don't maybe account for is the knock-on effect, like I said, that's going to have. So then all of a sudden, by being more direct, you're going to then need more second ball winners. So if your current team aren't second ball winners, you have to have those on the bench as well. Then you're going to have potentially wingers who are a little bit more traditional going down the line and crossing because you've got your big guy in. So I think there's definitely conversations around sort of, I suppose, plan Bs, plan Cs, and different alternative or tactical solutions, we like to call them. But I think obviously set piece coaches will always have that in their mind. That's their job, is to make sure that they have, suggested backups for different changes for different situations that they're presented with. But I think there's a way that you could potentially be a little bit more deliberate with creating maybe actual scenarios that you think you could exploit, which is probably leads us quite nicely onto my next slide if I jump on. And this is sort of what my last comment was sort of leaning into here. So this is the goals sort of scored per sort of 15 minutes throughout the Premier League. Now, obviously the total is in the second column. Then we break it down into sort of corner kicks and wide free kicks. So as you can see, I would say the first half is a really prominent time for set pieces to be scored. Now, I think it's worth mentioning that with this data, it would probably be more useful to have maybe a conversion rate as opposed to sort of a sum total, just because of the resources I have. I haven't been able to get my hands on that, so we're working off a sum total, but there's definitely a layer that you can add to this. But yeah, I mean, the first insight that I sort of felt like when I started collecting this data was, is there a better time to do your set piece routines? The way that we talk about subs is you look at your who's, your where's, your when's, your why's, and it just sort of like made me think, do people do that with set pieces? Do we look at, how the set piece is done? Do we look at when, where, and I suppose the timing of a set piece for me is something that is so minute, but probably could yield quite nice success, in the sense that it tends to be, more corner kicks are scored in the first half than in the second half, particularly early on in games? Is it a case of mentally players not have settled just yet? Is it a case of the chaos of the game is still quite high with the intensity? Um, so yeah, loads of different insights. But one thing that I think is worth mentioning again is the increase in defenders that we're seeing. I touched on it earlier about the knock-on effect of, these different substitutions. And I think what we're seeing now is, 10% increase in defenders coming on. I think what we're seeing is more defensively minded set pieces, particularly in the latter stages of games, which is why we sort of see that decline off towards the latter stages of a game. Particularly when we say that the first substitution on average this season for a Premier League team is around about the 62nd, 63rd minute. That falls really sort of in that 15-minute period where there is like a major drop off compared to sort of the previous 60 minutes build up in sort of set pieces being scored. So I think again, it would be great to hear set piece coaches' thoughts on this, about whether when you talk to a player and you bring on an attacker, do they receive the attacking set piece information better than they remember the defensive? And if you bring on a defender, is it the other way around? Do they remember their defensive duties better than their attacking? Because I think we're seeing an increase in defenders come on. Is that potentially influencing, less set pieces being scored or better set pieces being defended?
Yeah, I think the whole thing with set play data is a bit of a double-edged sword, right? Because a
Yeah.
defender can come on. He's obviously going to help. You'd think help defend set plays, but then
Mm.
can also help how they attack set plays as well. So
Yeah.
there's always that sort of two ways to think about the set play data, I think. And of course, we don't always know what information they're being shown as they come on or before the game. Is it more attacking set play focused, or is it more talking about the defensive side? I think fascinating to see how many more goals are scored there in the first half. I think
Mm.
from my experience, clubs will often try a particularly intricate routine from maybe the first corner or the first corner from a certain side in a game.
Mm.
Potentially could explain that spike in the first half. But yeah, keen to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, it would have been great to have, or great to hear the set piece coach's thoughts in the sense of, are they are they potentially trying more routines later, but they're not working? So is that the reason why, or are they using their routines early, which is why they are seeing a spike, and why we see sort of a drop off later because they then move away from those routines because you can only use it so many times probably before a team, at halftime particularly addresses those patterns that you're using against them. So yeah, it would be interesting to see when set piece coaches, if and how they plan certain times to use those routines. Because typically as well, I suppose first, again, you talk about double edged, but first minute of the game, you're arguably still building yourself into the intensity of the game and the routine and your technical maintenance. So might it be you let a set piece go before you use the one that you think is going to work so that you have a bit of a warm up? Do you do it from minute one because you know that they're going to be just as sort of flipped on the opposite side of the defending team, still understanding their sharpness? Like we touched on it again when we spoke earlier, has been how much of this is mental and how much of this is technical and tactical. Again, it'd be interesting to know some thoughts around whether that side of it sort of affects this data at all, whether there is just more, I suppose, mental capacity to remember a set piece in the first half than a second half routine, or yeah, it would be interesting.
Yeah, and I guess it's a really good point in terms of the physical fatigue as well as the mental fatigue. And I
Mm,
guess once each team has made three, four, five subs, those players on the pitch are completely different to the routines that were probably discussed at the start of, or before the game. I guess here, this is where having that set play culture, if you like, and that real identity can really help. So the subs coming on know exactly what perhaps they need to do in their particular role.
mm,
I just wanted to get your thoughts on when a substitution is coming on. Right, we all see them on TV. Right, the players coming
yeah.
on, the set play coach is there. He's got his sheets of paper that he's going through or an iPad that he's flicking through. What are your thoughts on sort of trying to take on information at that moment as a substitute?
No, I think it's a brilliant question, and it's something that we purposefully do go and try and influence when I go work with these clubs, is the ability to bring a player on. I think it's such an important part of the process, even from a match day -1 to the 70th minute and coming on. There's a huge amount of information and process that we build into that. But that sort of like 65 seconds that you get from manager turning around to player going on, I think is crucial. And we in my presentation that I deliver to clubs, I use a certain example from a club who, is a really big national team and in a really big game, and they've got a player pulling their jumper off. He's trying to reach for his shirt. He's looking down at his set pieces, and then just on for his shin pad, sorry, and then just on the side of the camera, you've just got the set piece coach like leaning in, and there is no way in hell that you can just have every stimulus being stimulated like that and be able to receive information with such clarity. So I think what we try and coach is like it being like a Formula One process. When a car comes in, every relevant department knows what they have to do in order to get that car as ready as possible, but as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible for it to go out ready and go and impact the race. And we try and create almost like a Formula One process for a player to go through the motions for when they come on. Um, And just obviously leading back to your original question, I think the role of a set piece coach within that Formula One process is so important in delivering information. I think understanding their learning styles is probably something that from players we've had a lot of feedback in terms of how they want to be, I suppose, considered. Some players quite enjoy sort of more of a visual aid, but some sort of enjoy bit more of a whiteboard, with the different ways that you can do it. Some can sort of audibly just understand. So I think that just the more clarity you can build around that, then I think the better, because I think, as I touched on earlier, I think when you when a player is on in this sort of like crazy atmosphere that's been created, I think they probably just sink to what they think is comfortable. That tends to be what the saying is. And if they're a defender, they're just going to remember probably their defensive roles better than their attacking, and obviously the opposite way around. So, again, it'd be great to get some thoughts on coaches' processes around this, how best they prepare a sub to come on, whether there's anyone that's doing it specifically with clips, with whiteboards, with obviously there's folders we've developed now to an iPad. So I think there's so many different ways you can do it. I think it's just finding and understanding your players.
Yeah, no, fascinating stuff. And yeah, please do reach out if anyone's got any particular thoughts on that. But yeah, just to wrap things up, really, Sammy, just wanted to thank you to say, how great it's been to see the data today. I don't think I certainly haven't seen data on substitutions really before. So hopefully this is, food for thought for a lot of people, and how the use of substitutes can impact set plays.
Mm.
Um, just before we do wrap things up, I don't know if you've got any advice for teams on how they could, better utilize substitutions to help them improve their set play.
Yeah, I think the two things are, firstly, taking inspiration from basketball, where they build their bench knowing that there's going to be certain patterns that they use that are going to rely on those certain players, and we sort of use this as a much larger philosophy for football. So in the sense of any tactical situation, we want to make sure we have the appropriate solution on the bench. So just when building your bench, I think you can be as deliberate as possible around maybe looking at probability and what sort of set pieces you might face, particularly for subs. It's typically the last 30 minutes of games. I think I presented to a team yesterday who did all this opposition analysis, and it was really, really brilliant. But it typically looked at what the game looked like nil-nil, what the game looked like up until 60, 70, but very, very little of the time do they look like, when a team's 2-0 down to 10 men, three up, being outpossessed, being outshot, away from home, at home. So and I'm sure that philosophy can be also be applied to set pieces, in the sense that the more you can look at the different situations that you might face, the more you can sort of have those appropriate solutions ready. And then secondly, just the way that you deliver information, the process that you have that player go through before they go on and potentially go on with a crucial piece of information. I think if you can simplify that with as much clarity as possible, then I think there's going to be a lot of value in players just understanding their roles and responsibilities a little bit better.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point actually, in terms of, thinking about substitutions and how they affect set plays, not just for your team, but for the opposition as well.
Yeah.
Like, if I'm an opposition analyst, I should be giving information to my set play coach about how their set plays change once they're behind in games, what their set plays look like when they're, protecting a lead in the last 10
Yeah.
minutes. It's a really, really good point. But as I say, fascinating stuff, Sammy. So thank you very much for sharing. Just lastly, where can people get hold of you if they want to follow up on anything we've covered today?
Yeah, so I'm typically a little bit more present on LinkedIn. So Sammy Lander on LinkedIn, or my email address, which I'll make sure is dropped in the description. And then I've also got a book out at the moment called Finishers, which sort of talks about my journey from when I was first a sub myself at a non-league club called Weymouth, and transitioning into a coach, and the whole journey that this sort of sub thing has taken me from non-league to international football in 5 years, and building methodologies for different clubs and different leagues all over the world. And hopefully, this will be the start of a slightly new chapter, and hopefully someone, or something in set pieces.
Wonderful. And we'll of course include all of that information in the description for this video. But yeah, thanks again, Sammy, and we'll speak to you soon.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity.